BYU basketball continues to struggle. We're talking about Egor Demin and his impact. Plus, is Richie Saunders the best player on BYU basketball's team? And finally, Crew Wakley transferring to Purdue. How BYU is going to fill his position in the secondary. That's all coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. Hello and welcome to the Aptive Podcast Studio. This is the Loyal Cougars podcast where we're talking about what you, the fans, are talking about. And this week we have a very special guest, someone that I've wanted to get in since week one, Jake Hatch. Welcome to the show, Jake.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I've been watching you guys since you debuted this bad boy, so it's really cool to be here and be hanging out. By the way, this is an incredible setup you guys have. Beats the crap out of what I got.
We're honestly I'm very grateful to Aptive for providing this studio. It's been a godsend for us.
Sure.
As we try and get this podcast off the ground and rolling. If you like what you hear on this podcast, please like and subscribe. We're on all of the podcast channels. We're on YouTube. We're on social media. If you want to leave a review as well, if you like what you hear, please do that. It's going to only help us moving forward as we try and get this podcast up and rolling.
Convince the algorithms that you're important.
Yes, we want Apple Podcasts to think that, to know that you like our show. Plus, it's helpful for us, right? We want the feedback, so it's important. The funny story about Jake, I interned for Gregor Bell. Jake interned for Gregor Bell. Jake interned before I did. I don't know when did you intern for him?
Maybe it's 2010, 2011, that time.
And I would have been about 2012. So Jake was known as Intern Jake, right? Yeah. As Greg does, right? Yes. He calls all of his interns by their first name, Intern Jake. I came along a year and a half later, and I was Jake 2.0, and I like to joke that I am the new and improved version.
As you should, because he went back to referring to me as Jake 1.0 at that point.
Yeah. And Jake's obviously gone on to, you interned for David Locke as well. You've done a lot of radio. You now produce for DJ and PK in the mornings on the Zone Sports Network. How long have you been doing that for?
Oh, geez. Essentially, wow. When I left Greg, I did that year you mentioned with David Locke, and since that time, I worked with Ben Criddle for a short stint doing Cougar Sports, and then the last 10 years, I've been with DJ and PK, so a decade. It's crazy.
You're like a veteran.
A lot of early mornings, I'll just say that.
Yeah. And you do a good job. I know that show's been one of the highest rated shows in the state for a long time.
There's a reason why they keep doing what they're doing.
So, and now you have your own podcast. So let's, I think that's huge as well, right? David Locke. For those that don't know, David Locke, he's the voice of the Jazz. He's created his own podcast network called Locked On. Jake hosts Locked On BYU Cougars, which is a daily podcast focused on BYU. And honestly, I'm impressed with your ability to create content on a daily basis.
It's a struggle some days, yes.
Sure, especially in the off season. Yeah. You have a lot to talk about now, but so let's kind of get into what we're going to talk about.
Sure.
And honestly, probably something that you've talked about on your show as well. BYU continues to struggle, and I think after the Houston game, BYU fans were kind of understanding. Houston is potentially a number one seed, right? I think they're one
really
or two best team in the conference, and it's a stacked conference, right? So I think Houston on the road, a venue that Houston hasn't lost in 29 games or whatever, it was understandable, right? Texas Tech less understandable, and I think going into the game, we thought BYU had a pretty good shot because they play well at home.
Yeah.
And Texas Tech shoots the ball well. We knew they were going to shoot the ball well. And they just shot the lights out of BYU.
Well, and they did. And the other thing is BYU's defense early on in that Texas Tech game, it was holding up just fine. But as soon as Texas Tech figured it out, you saw them time and time again start to torch BYU. If I'm not mistaken, they scored on 11 of 15 possessions down the stretch. And that shows you the defense got figured out, and then they never had the counter to the counter, if that analogy makes sense. You couldn't adjust on the fly well enough to slow down Texas Tech, and that's a disappointing loss. You lose to Texas Tech, that one's going to stick with you. Okay, that's a home game, should have had it, could have had it, but then you go to TCU.
And I will say Texas Tech was disappointing in a different way, right?
Yeah.
Because it was a Q1 win that felt possible, right? It was almost like an easy Q1 win if those are possible. And so that's why it was disappointing. Then you go to TCU and you're thinking, all right, well, they can at least rebound against a team that's historically not great. I think BYU had won almost 20 times in a row. I think it was like 17 or 18 times in a row. They hadn't lost since 1997 against TCU.
They were in the WAC when they last
Totally.
won.
And it's not like it's a TCU team that they barely play, right? They were in the Mountain West with them. Like they've played them a lot. I think it was 17 or 18 times in a row. And I don't think TCU was really good at anything. They were okay at a lot of things. They weren't really good at anything. And BYU just could not figure out. Honestly, they shot themselves in the foot. And they couldn't figure out how to close the game.
Well, yeah, when you were scoreless to the final, it was about 90-ish seconds. They didn't get a single point out of that. I think they scored 2 points in the final 4, maybe 5 minutes. And when you do that, you're asking for trouble. Now, the funny thing about that was you saw the end of the first half of that game, a 14-1 run. They were down 10. You're like, oh boy, now they're in trouble. And all of a sudden, Richie Saunders powers an incredible run. 14-1, they take a halftime lead. All right, they've restored order.
Yeah.
But then the second half, it becomes a slog. And then you mentioned late in that game, kind of the complete reverse of the first half, where you can't score much like TCU did in the first half, and they take it to them.
And we'll talk more about Richie in the next segment because I think Richie is without him, I think BYU is struggling. I don't think BYU is a tournament team. They may not be a tournament team anyway, right? The way they're playing right now, but
sitting at 1-3, it seems like a hard thing to say that they're going to make the tournament. But they have an opportunity. There's 16 games to go. They could turn it around, but they got to get it started ASAP.
And I do think part of their struggles, and they addressed it a little bit by bringing Dallin off the bench. Part of their struggles is Egor Demin and his ability to play with the guys on the court with him.
Yeah.
And I can't really put my finger on it, right? So since the Ole Miss game, and granted, it's probably really since the Big 12, but since the Ole Miss game, he's averaging 8.1 points per game, 9.4% from three. 4 points. So he's still getting his assists, 4.9 assists, but he's averaging over 3 turnovers a game.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's because of the physicality. He's just not used to that. He's coming from Europe where they're more finesse. Looking back at his kind of scouting grade, his weaknesses have been, even before he came to BYU, his shooting, 3-point shooting. He turns the ball over. His handles are not where they should be for a point guard. He sees the floor really well, so that's a good thing, right? That's where he grades well.
His court vision is absolutely incredible.
And so he's going to average 4, 5, 6 assists a game.
He'll find guys that other people can't find.
But if he's turning the ball over 3 times or more a game, in a game against TCU where they turned it over 16 times, he's the ball handler, right? He needs to take care of the ball. And I think until he can find a way to do that and deal with the physicality of the Big 12, he's going to continue to struggle. Granted, he's only 18, so it's hard to say like he's not an NBA guy or he's not a lottery pick because of these handful of games that he's been struggling. But he's got to grow into this kind of role and adjust to this kind of play. Otherwise, I think scouts are going to start kind of pulling back a little bit on him.
Well, and I'll bring something. So earlier this week on my podcast, I'm not sure when you'll post this, but Rafael Barlow does the NBA Big Board, and he travels the world scouting guys. And he mentioned the fact that he saw Egor for the first time when he was 15 years old over in Europe. Egor was playing for Team Russia in I would assume it's a FIBA or something like event. And he said that everything about Egor that is true today was true then. And what he meant is he has elite size, he had elite vision, had above average athleticism, had all these different tools that you're like, okay, I see it. I see the vision of what this guy can become. Now, he played for Real Madrid, and he's come over to the United States with the whole goal of proving that he can play at this level. You mentioned the fact he's 18 years old. I think the other thing was when he got injured against Providence and missed almost a month's worth of time, that set him back a long way.
Yes.
And then the other thing about Rafael, when he came on with DJ and PK, he said that right now, it may be in his best interest to come back and play with AJ DeBonsa. Because as he mentioned, he's a 6'9", really tall, long player, that's what the NBA teams covet. But as you mentioned, his handles and his turnover numbers indicate that, okay, he maybe not be a point guard. As Rafael said, he's probably more of a link-up guy where he's kind of playing on the wing. He helps facilitate things, but he doesn't have the ball in his hands every single play. I think Egor in his mind, though, I'm a point guard.
Yes.
And that's where the rub is right now, is what's his best position at the next level and how long will it take for him to get to that next level?
And I think By the way, as far as NBA draft projections, ESPN's Jeremy Wu has him at 8 to the Kings.
Okay.
Fox Sports, John Fanta has him at 13 to the Jazz.
Hey, Danny Ainge is signing off on that.
I think
right
Jazz
now.
fans might be okay. I mean, maybe not Utah Jazz fans, but
Yeah.
BYU Jazz fans are probably okay with that.
Yeah.
NBA Draft.net has him at 5 to the Raptors. NBA DraftRoom.com has him at 7 to the Blazers.
Okay.
So he's still a projected lottery guy.
Yeah.
But I think he compares, and this is just my own comp, to a Ricky Rubio with less handles, right? Ricky can dribble the heck out of the ball, but he can't shoot, right? That was his was his weakness. He couldn't shoot the ball, but he had great court vision. He was an assist guy. Egor, obviously a longer, 6'9", and I think he's got like a 6'10", 6'11" foot wingspan.
And why NBA teams like him is he is a jumbo-sized guard.
Yes.
And that's what they want. They want size. They want elite size. Wingspan, height, that's everything that he brings to the table. But I think your comparison right now, it looks very apt. Ricky was, 6'4"-ish?
Shorter, yes.
But you're talking the same type of production where they see the court incredibly well. They're going to set their teammates up in really, really good spots to score. But the problem is, in this day and age, especially when it comes to the NBA game, if you can't shoot, you can't play.
They talk about gravity, right?
Yeah.
You need gravity. And for those that don't know what gravity is, it's talked about a lot in the NBA nowadays. Your ability to, even if you're not shooting the ball, your ability to attract a defender out of the paint.
Yeah.
Right. And Ricky could never do that. And I think that's why Utah, the Jazz, struggled offensively the year that he played. Defensively, they were great, right? I think Egor can get to that point where if he can improve his handling, he doesn't even have to shoot the ball that much better.
Yeah.
But if he can improve his handling, he can at least initiate the offense, get downhill, right?
Yeah.
And then what the Jazz used to call the blender, start the blender. And get his teammates going.
Well, and that's the thing about it is he has an ability to get where he wants on the court at any point he wants. He's got that athleticism, and you've seen it. When he turns the corner in the college game, nobody's stopping him getting to the rim. He'll lay it up. He'll jam it. He'll do whatever he needs to do to score. The one thing I like about Egor is you can tell that there's a hunger there. He wants to be a good player. I've had conversations with guys like Travis Hansen, and Travis obviously has a connection to him via his time playing in Russia. And Travis talked about the fact that this kid is just he's got to want to be the best he possibly can be. Now, there are guys who have proven when you get to the NBA level that they learn how to shoot. There's other guys that the shooting woes continue to follow them. I think right now, if you're looking at Egor, you're like, okay, he's got to be able to prove he can shoot at this level if he wants to take the next step. NBA teams, some of them may convince themselves, hey, we have great developmental coaches. We'll get him to where he needs to go. But I think right now, if you're a BYU fan looking in this circumstance, you're hoping that shooting comes around very, very quickly because until it does, teams like a Houston are going to be able to play 4-on-5 essentially against you. And that hurts you immensely because the book is out on BYU. Get physical with them, get up on them in terms of defense, and force them off the three-point line. And BYU struggles to counter that. And until they can improve, that involves Egor, that involves Kevin Young and the rest of the BYU basketball program, until they can prove that they can counter that narrative, teams are going to keep doing it to them.
There's one guy on BYU's team right now that I think can handle that physicality really well and really thrives off of physicality, and that's Richie Saunders. And we'll talk more about him coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. This episode is brought to you by Aptiv. Aptiv believes that every home should be enjoyed. They tailor their pest control treatment plans to target pests when and where they're most active. Plus, if you see pest activity between treatments, Aptiv will return to take care of the problem at no additional cost. It's their way of making sure every customer is satisfied and every pest is controlled. If pests stay away, Aptiv is why. Visit goaptiv.com or call 844-966-4787 and mention this promotion to get your initial treatment for just $29. That's goaptiv.com or call 844-966-4787. Get home field advantage with Aptiv. All right, let's talk about BYU's, in my opinion, best player right now on the court.
Hard to argue otherwise.
Richie Saunders, a guy who, after last season, was going to transfer, right? I think it's huge. I think that's the best pickup, right, of BYU's offseason so far. Granted, I think the potential of Egor, we've talked about him, the potential of Cannon is high. The potential of Dallin is high.
Sure.
But Richie right now is performing, and I think it's even hard to argue otherwise. that Richie right now is the best player on the team.
Well, and there's a reason why Mark Pope had him come out to Lexington to try and convince him to come to Kentucky, because Mark knows what Richie is. And the nice part about what Richie has shown so far this year is an ability to really improve his offensive output, because we hear all the time, he's this glue guy. He's the sixth man. He's the guy that makes everything go for BYU basketball. What he's proven this year, to your point, Jake, is he is absolutely dynamite on offense. And without him, quite frankly, how poor offensively is this team without him? That's a scary proposition to consider, what we know about this team right now. Without his offensive output, I shudder to think where they're at right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned him being kind of evolving away from this glue guy role to this more impact player.
He's a feature guy. Yeah.
John Rothstein said the same thing. This was actually after the Arizona State game last week.
And it holds true regardless.
He said, "Is Richie Saunders about to graduate from glue guy status? Dropped 30 today and 6 made 3-pointers or 3-point shots as BYU beats Arizona State by 20 in Provo." These are national guys, right? Not just BYU fans talking about Richie and his impact on the team. Now you got national guys. And so Richie had 30 against Arizona State, 26 against TCU. He's shooting 43% from three, 52% from the field.
Yeah.
And not only that, like those are like measurable numbers.
Sure.
His impact off the ball, his impact at taking kind of this physicality from Big 12 teams and dishing it back. He's the only guy on the team, maybe Keita to an extent, but Keita's not a ball handler, right? So and he's not going to post you up.
Yeah.
Richie's the guy that can get into the body of other players as an offense, as a ball handler, and create space. And there's nobody else on the team that can do that.
And the one thing I like about him is he's unafraid. That's the thing about this. Is some guys you'll see shy away from physicality, and they don't necessarily want to take some of the hits that they will take on the court. Richie relishes it. I think of that play against Wyoming where he got the concussion and busted his lip up. If I'm not mistaken, that was a full shoulder right to the mouth. And I'm like, wow, but he's willing to put his nose where it can get injured. And I appreciate the fact that he is a consummate ball player. He doesn't care. He'll risk life and limb to just make plays. And the nice part is he's got elite size to go with it. 6'6". He's really long and athletic. He really gets after it defensively. He may not be the world's best defensive player. I don't think anybody would say that he's going to be an all Big 12 defender.
He's not even his team's best. Mag's probably the team's best defensive player.
Moa has been absolutely awesome. But the thing is, he gets after it, and he doesn't take plays off. That's the other thing I like about him is you can tell that he's got a love for the game, and he is not going to let it pass him by.
Yeah, he's a high motor guy. And honestly, at the college level, those are the types of guys that every team needs. Like they have to succeed.
Well, and so PK likes to talk about program guys. It's something that came from Dave Rose. Dave Rose used to come on our show a lot, and Dave would talk about how he liked guys who would come into a program and grow with the program. Richie went on a mission. He's done all these different things. He's now an older player, and he's stuck with BYU. And I think we're seeing the benefits of him sticking around, working on his game bit by bit, and he's getting even better as we go on along here because I would have never guessed, Jake, that he was going to score 30 points in a Big 12 game a year ago.
No.
I don't think anybody would have.
No.
But the thing is, he worked on his offensive game. He rounded that out. And it goes to show what Dave Rose talked about. When guys stick around programs, they're inevitably going to get better. And the benefit is it's ancillary to the program because they obviously understand what BYU is all about. They're going to benefit by being in the community. In this day and age of NIL, guess what? When your face is out there, people want to pay you for your name, image, and likeness. And Richie's benefiting from that, I'm sure, to a level as well. So I really appreciate what he's done. And the nice part is it still feels like he's got levels he can reach.
Yeah. Do you know who he reminds me of?
Who's that?
BYU guy, Jackson Emery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Defensive guy, high motor, high IQ, shoots the ball well.
And shoots from three extremely well. Yeah. Remember, Jackson was a deadeye from three.
But he's also – Jackson was okay at being the secondary guy, right? Jim was obviously the obvious number one. I think Richie is not looking for the limelight. No. Like, he's not looking for the spotlight. He's just kind of – I actually don't even know if they draw plays up for Richie that much.
Probably not. Like, now – I think back to that TCU game, and Egor got stuck in a bad spot and heaved one up in that circumstance. I would have liked to see a guy like Dallin Hall or Richie, who had a really good game, get something drawn up in that circumstance for him. Yeah. But your point holds, though, that they're not in the middle of an after timeout and being like, all right, we're finding Richie, everybody.
And that may change.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe it changed towards the end of the game.
Maybe.
Obviously, they went to Egor at the end, but he the way he's playing, he's going to have to be the guy.
And he does not mind going out and making just winning plays. He wants to win basketball games first and foremost. Kind of what Jackson was when you talk about Jackson. I was in high school the same time as Jackson Emery, and Jackson was Mr. Everything at Lone Peak. Yeah. I went to Mountain View High School. We were in the same region as him. I remember watching him play, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this guy is absolute dynamite. And when he got to BYU, he was still a very good player, but as you mentioned, he realized there's this guy named Jimmer Fredette over here. Mm-hmm. He's going to lead us to the promised land. My job is to play second fiddle to him and make up where he doesn't do it. And we all know Jimmer wasn't necessarily a keen defensive player. Mm-hmm. Jackson made up for that, and he made winning basketball plays. I think your comparison for what Richie is, he simply wants to make the winning basketball play.
So Kevin Young, this is from what I heard in a broadcast. Yeah. I didn't see Kevin say it. He says Richie's an NBA guy.
I would,
and he compared him. Do you know who?
No, I didn't hear.
Who would you compare him to in the NBA? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Give me a guy like an Alex Caruso.
That's who he.
Oh, he did. He said Alex Caruso.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it makes sense because Alex has made his bones in the NBA, being a defensive guy who he's 4th, 5th, 6th option on his own team. But he makes winning basketball plays.
Just a scrappy guy, right?
And you can appreciate that.
The other guy that, and maybe not like the physical characteristics match, but like a Dellavedova.
Okay.
Just a guy who's just like, he may like have to fight for a roster spot, Richie, but he's willing to do it, right? Like Dellavedova, for all intents and purposes, should not have been like an NBA guy.
No, but he made it simply because you talk about gravity.
Yeah.
Dellavedova could force teams to come out to him because he could hit big shots. He broke the hearts of Cougar Nation when he hit that half-court shot. I was there sitting on press row when he hit that. I'm like, oh, my goodness. He just broke the hearts of 18,000 fans. And the thing about it is those guys, they're valuable. And I'll use another example of a local guy, Sam Merrill, up at Utah State. Sam is end of the bench guy with the Cleveland Cavaliers, but he sticks around because he does things well that the Cavs value. Yeah. And when he gets his opportunities, he makes the most of them.
Yeah, and that's Richie to a T.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about BYU games coming up this week because I think finally TCU should have been really the start of this this easy schedule coming up.
Well, in theory.
Yeah. Obviously, that wasn't the case. And granted, TCU's on the road, so you can give them a little bit of an excuse. But I think that was a bad loss. Mm-hmm. This would be a worse loss, Oklahoma State. And honestly, Utah as well. Mm-hmm. Utah is in Salt Lake, and BYU has traditionally struggled when they shouldn't have in Salt Lake City. But let's talk about Oklahoma State just briefly because I think they're a bad team. And I think if BYU loses, and I said this last week with TCU, I said if BYU loses to TCU, then we're really talking about are they worthy for a tournament spot? If they lose to Oklahoma State, they're not even on the bubble, in my opinion. Like they
write them off. Yeah,
they're pretty much an NIT team. Like unless they make some miraculous run in the conference play. Oklahoma State, they do not shoot the ball well, and they don't defend well. Like that's like what matters the most, right? They shoot the ball poorly, they defend poorly.
Well, in Oklahoma State, they've turned this over. They got a brand new head coach, so it's kind of I know the term year zero with college football programs. Oklahoma State, they're at the bottom and they're trying to build back up. And that's the thing about this is I look at this Cowboys team, they went and got absolutely drilled at Utah. Mm-hmm. So if BYU aspires to be better than Oklahoma State, better than Utah, you in theory should drill this Oklahoma State team. And that I said it on my own podcast is that this week for BYU, Jake, you got to go 2-0. It's a must-win week.
Have to. Yeah.
You got to get back to 3-3 in conference. You got to reestablish that, hey, we're not as bad as we've been thought to be after a 3-game losing streak. And if you want, because I think most people projected Oklahoma State and Utah to be bottom tier Big 12 programs. Okay, if you want to be middle tier, I think that's what kind of BYU is looking at right now. You got to beat these two.
Yes, and I'm looking. Oh, this is football. I don't know what the spread is on this game. I imagine it's probably the highest it's been since BYU's played in conference this season. So okay, throw that game out the window. I think they have to win it. Utah also a must-win game. In the sense of if you lose this game, then you're really battling right for a playoff spot. Utah, I think, is a little bit better. They distribute the ball really well. They're second in the country in assists, and so they make their shots, but they also assist in their shot. So they don't have like these kind of individual playmakers. They're more of like a blender team where they drive, they kick it. They have some really good shooters in Gabe Matson and Mason Matson. Gabe is a high volume 3-point shooter, so he's going to put it up a lot. 36%, so not necessarily the most efficient 3-point shooter. Mason Matson shoots it at 42.4% from three, which, that's one of the best 3-point shooters BYU is going to face this year.
And let's be honest, BYU has been a team that's struggled defending the 3-point line.
Yes.
Like, that's just acknowledge a spade for a spade.
Texas Tech exposed them.
Exactly.
Right?
And guess what? Every other team, when they go in the game plan, they say, BYU, they don't defend the 3, we're going to hoist them up.
Mm-hmm. And Utah already does that. Mm-hmm. And so can they make it? They're at home, right? They're in Salt Lake. Mm-hmm. So this kind of has the makings of an upset. And I don't even know what the spread's going to be, right? But like this feels like it could be one of those, Utah shoots the lights out at home for no particular reason other than they're playing BYU, and they come away with, this. Maybe they pull away late for like a 5 or 7 point win. I hope that's not the case.
But I think that's the fear right now. It's a valid fear.
And again, BYU needs to figure it out, right? It's not just Egor, right? Like we've talked about Egor, and I think it's probably like unfair to hype him as much as we have. Granted, he's a lottery. Him and Cannon, they're lottery picks. But like he's struggling. Keita's struggling. I think Foose is even struggling. Dallin's definitely struggling. Like this kind of culmination of all these guys, and I don't know how to even explain it, because like it's essentially the same roster, except for you replace Khalifa with Keita, and you bring in Egor.
Yeah.
You replace Jackson Robinson with like a Cannon Catchings, right?
Yeah.
So like those are the two guys you lose. You bring in guys that are supposed to be better, and somehow they're just not there. I don't know if they're just not gelling. We've talked about it, I feel like ad nauseum, as Kyle Whittingham loves to say. But they've got to figure it out.
Let me posit one thing, and I'm speaking from the fan perspective, just based on feedback I have seen, is that fans, I think the minimum expectation for BYU this year, with the hoopla that went on around this team, you bring in Egor Demin, you bring in Cannon Catchings, Mihailo Boskovic, who was falling out of the rotation here, was also a pretty highly thought of guy.
He wasn't even. Did he even play against TCU?
No, he didn't. Somebody told me he wasn't even on the trip. Now, could that be health related? I don't know. But the bigger point is the hype around this team, Jake, was so big.
Yeah.
Remember, going into the BYU football season, there were so many people like, hey, can we skip to basketball season?
Yeah.
I remember seeing those legitimate conversations amongst fans. And that's the thing about this is the hype has obviously not matched the substance right now. And they're going to have to claw their way back to matching what fans expect of this team. And I thought that the minimum expectation for, I think, most lay fans out there, and I'd be happy to be corrected if not, was they make the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
I think that was the bare minimum expectation for this squad with the hype, the talent coming in here. Well, guess what? You're currently sitting in the bottom tier with the Oklahoma States, with the Utahs. Now you got to claw your way back up into the middle of the pack, and that's going to be really tough to do, but the opportunity, it's got to start tomorrow night against Oklahoma State, and then obviously you got to go to Salt Lake and win that game. Now, we saw last year Utah. It was a BYU takeover there in the Huntsman Center. I was there. Mm-hmm. Cougar fans outnumbered Utah fans. I have no problem saying that. And Utah pulled out that win. You got to go and flip the script this year. You got to get the W in Salt Lake.
I feel like every time BYU does a takeover, they lose.
Well,
like an organized takeover.
But it was a really cool environment. I'm expecting a similar environment on Saturday night. The biggest thing is the whole mentality for this BYU Cougars team, I think this week in basketball, is it doesn't matter if it comes ugly, pretty, however you get it, go 2-0.
Yes. And I'll wrap it up with this, just this segment with this. If BYU is going to make a tournament, they have to be at least one of the 8 best teams. Yeah, 8, right? 8's probably the max. I think 7 or 8 is kind of what you're looking at with Big 12 teams making the tournament. Iowa State, Houston, Arizona, Kansas, West Virginia. I think those are locks. Essentially, like unless they collapse, right?
Injuries, something.
Baylor is pretty close to a lock. Mm-hmm. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. Right. You're looking at 1 or 2 other spots.
Jeez.
Between a Texas Tech, an Arizona State, a BYU. UCF's playing pretty well, but like you have 2 spots and realistically probably 4 teams to fill them. And BYU's got to get in that group.
You know what comes to mind about this? Just a pop culture reference. It's the Batman movies when a Joker breaks the pool cue and tosses it on the floor.
Yeah.
we got a spot for one guy and we're having tryouts, and three guys that look at each other like, oh crap. You're right. I think those 6 teams very easily would be imagined. Most people would say those are the locks. And if there's 1 or 2 spots up for grabs, there's 5 or 6 other teams like, no, that's our spot.
Yeah. And BYU has a chance to get into that spot, starting with these 2 games this week. They also have Colorado and Cincinnati next week. Very winnable games.
In theory.
To win 4 in a row. They have to, right? If they don't, we're talking about NIT.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bottom line. All right, that'll do it for basketball. You had an interview on The Zone with DJ and PK with Crew Wakley, and it's kind of it's almost like perfect timing because so many BYU fans are talking about Crew Wakley for other reasons. But we're going to talk about Crew's interview with DJ and PK because I thought he said some pretty interesting things and some things he didn't say that were also interesting. So we'll talk about all that coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. Looking to get your brand in front of BYU's most engaged fans, the Loyal Cougars podcast and Cougar Board are your perfect match. Cougar Board is the largest online community of BYU fans with thousands of posts every day. The Loyal Cougars podcast is the official podcast of Cougar Board, and we have sponsorship opportunities available for both the podcast and the site. Contact us at sponsorships@loyalcougars.com, and we'll help your message hit home with the Cougar faithful. Again, that's sponsorships@loyalcougars.com. All right, it's a topic that BYU fans across the country, Cougar Board, Twitter, are talking about. It's Crew Wakley and the aftermath of his
exit.
Rumor. Yeah. Well, his exit, but prior to that, this kind of rumor that's been spreading about Crew. We're going to talk about his interview in just a second, but I do want to address the rumor because there has been a little bit more come to light that's a little more solidified. For those that listened to the podcast last week, I mentioned this was going to kind of explode, and it did. And at the time, I actually thought it was very much just a rumor. Like, I didn't think there was much smoke to it.
Sure.
It sounds like there are at least some facts that are coming out. And granted, none of these are official, right? These are still just coming from sources that we trust, that you trust, that Crew and Dallin Levitt did watch film together.
They're very close, yeah. And
they're friends. That makes sense.
And Dallin's an NFL veteran. He's got a lot of experience watching and breaking down film. It seems very natural that those two, if they're as close as what I understand them to be, that they'd watch film, and Dallin's given his expertise and his insight to help Crew along the way, because Crew is a really, really good football player for BYU.
Yeah.
There's just zero doubt about it. You don't become a starting strong safety at the Power 5, as now Power 4 level for BYU without doing something really, really good.
And here's the only thing I'll say about it, because that's all we know.
Yeah.
Right? We don't know what Dallin did with that information. We don't know if Dallin actually gathered enough intel to share with his brother Sam, who is a quarterback at ASU. That the rumor is that Dallin shared this film study information with his brother Sam before the BYU Arizona State game, which led to an offensive onslaught from Arizona State in the first half. Believe that if you would like. You don't have to. I don't know. It just kind of depends on what intentions you think those guys have. I will say this: Crew seems like a very well-spoken, smart guy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
However, if you're gonna watch film with somebody, and granted he's his friend, I get it, but like you've got to know that he's got access to a player on a team on BYU's schedule. I don't even care if it's Sam. I don't care if it's Brandon Rose. I feel like you should kind of acknowledge that. And maybe he did and just trusted Dallin as a friend to keep it just kind of confidential between the two. But
sure.
I think that if I had any criticism for Crew, I don't think Crew had any bad intentions, by the way. The only criticism I would have is that, like, I feel like you need to recognize that this information that you're watching is somewhat confidential and can, if it falls into the wrong hands, can be damaging.
Well, in this day and age of all kinds of leaks all the time, we're talking of every variety. I'm not talking just like football. Teams have to be hyper vigilant of people hacking and getting proprietary information. And that includes film, that includes game plans, that includes player evaluations. We saw the New York Knicks sued the Toronto Raptors a couple of years ago over hacking into a system and stealing proprietary information. We've seen the Houston Astros get busted for this in the past.
Michigan,
yeah. Here's the deal. You have to be hyper vigilant to not let that information get disseminated and get it into the wrong hands. when you have an opponent who's got a brother who's their starting quarterback, I want to be a little careful with that information. And you know what? You mentioned it caused an absolute firestorm on social media across Cougar Board, across X, aka Twitter, and for good reason. And I still do too, but it got overblown to a large level. And getting to the point, we want to talk about Crew when he came on with DJ and PK on the KSL Sports Zone, and I had reached out to Crew early on. I had sent him a DM on social media and said, "Hey, Crew, you entered the portal. Our whole purpose with bringing him on originally was to get a feel for how athletes operate in the portal space. That's kind of the whole idea. Is like we want to get a firsthand account of how things operate when it comes to going into the transfer portal. Crew originally agreed to join us almost more than 2 weeks before when we actually had him on. He said, "Yeah, I'll do it. Let's do it." So I had set it up, and then he got back to me and said, "Hey, I'm gonna push off on this. I want to actually finally get where I'm going, commit, and then we'll do it." And I was like, "Okay, who talked to him? Who talked him out of doing it?" But to his credit, when he finally committed to Purdue, I reached back out to him. He said, "Let's do it." Had him on Friday morning, and he mentioned he's a very well-spoken young man, driven. There's zero doubt about that. He's a driven young man, and he wants to find an opportunity for himself where he can highlight his skills to the highest level possible, and he feels like the Purdue Boilermakers are the spot for him.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting because through all this kind of drama that people are talking about, these rumors that are being talked about, you would think that BYU would be more than anxious to get rid of him. And I say get rid of in a like negative way, right? Like they just want to kick him out, right? Like they're done with him.
Yeah.
If that were the case, right?
Yes.
But he left on good terms. I mean, he talked about, and in the interview, he talked about having nothing but love for Kalani. He said that Kalani did everything possible to help Crew find a landing spot. Yeah. And he was actually kind of sad to see him leave. And I don't think, Crew made it very obvious that like he left because he felt forced to leave in the sense that not because BYU wanted him out. BYU didn't necessarily they weren't mad at him. They weren't trying to like fire him per se.
Yeah.
It was only because it was pretty obvious that BYU was stacked at safety and for Crew to get enough playing time to make a case to be an NFL player, which everyone wants.
Sure.
He needed to go somewhere else. And so, Purdue was the right spot. And look, BYU, I think filling his position, filling his production, because even he split reps this year, right? Yeah. He wasn't a full-time starter, a full-time safety. BYU's got guys that can replace him. I don't think it's going to hurt that Crew's gone. You've got Raider, Demooney, you've got Satuwala, you've got Process, you've got Tanner Wall, and then guys behind them. You're stacked at safety. Here's what I thought was interesting about this interview, and it may have been intentional, it may not have been. He called out Kalani. He called out his meeting with Kalani. Kalani actually, he said he was kind of sad for the meeting to leave or to end because that meant that like it was done.
It's over. Yeah.
And Crew literally said he went from the meeting and straight to the compliance office to submit his papers or to get papers to submit for a transfer. He called out Kalani. He called out Papinga. He called out Fessy. Who would you think should be part of that list?
Maybe his position coach, aka the defensive coordinator at BYU.
Yeah,
Jay Hill,
like the guy that's like coaching him every day.
There was no mention of Jay Hill in that interview. I've listened back to it a couple of times myself.
None. And I listened to that segment where he calls out Kalani, he calls out K-pop, he calls out Fessy. It was very quick. Yeah. Right. He just was like randomly like three guys.
Yeah.
So it may mean nothing, right? This is very much like me just kind of speculating and maybe reading between the lines, but it's interesting because Coach Hill was his main coach.
Well, and to your point is replacing the production that Crew had, it appears to be very doable because I think anybody who watched the bowl game, watched Raider Demooney have like his coming out party. Like Raider Demooney was lights out of that strong safety position, which was what Crew was playing. Tanner Wall was the free safety, is where he's been playing all season long. You mentioned there's other dudes. Falatau Satuwala, he looks like he's ready to really emerge. Tommy Prassis had really, really high and some really low moments this year, but that's inevitable for an 18-year-old true freshman. Yep. But all three of those guys in particular look like dudes who can step up into that role. And I won't even count out a guy like Preston Rex. Now, Preston Rex got himself injured this year, but Preston's been a pretty highly thought of athlete in that safety room as well. So in terms of sheer production, they'll replace it. It's an interesting dynamic when you have a starting player leave your program and they go on radio and say, well, I was essentially forced to leave. That was the terminology he used. The decision was, quote, made for me.
Yeah, which I think that's a stretch. He made the decision, right?
Yeah,
it's a smart decision.
He ultimately made the decision himself to go and find a new place to play. But the other point he made is I was told I was going to be splitting time next year. Well, guess what? BYU can't tell Raider Demooney, Falatau Satuala, Tommy Prassis, anybody else in that room and say, hey, by the way, you're going to sit for another year while this guy plays out his eligibility. Those guys are going to make the decision and be like, hey, transfer portal, here I come. So I appreciate what Crew did for BYU because he proved to be a very, very good player.
Yes.
But I think BYU realized in some ways we need to sacrifice the PR hit we'll take with him in essentially the future of our safety room. Because you would have had, I think, at least two of the guys we've already mentioned, I think a combination of Raider, Tommy, or Falatau probably would have said, okay, well, I'm going to go look for another place to play. And that's the concern is you could all of a sudden have yourself with a senior safety next year who could be very, very good. But then beyond that, you're like, who else do we have in the room?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's understandable that Crew left. I don't think it's going to affect the production at the safety level. And so I think the future is still bright in the secondary. In fact, I'm kind of surprised at how bright BYU's secondary, the future of BYU secondary is because historically they haven't been. And so I'm excited to see what these guys can do with Raider and Tanner, and then obviously the guys backing them up, assuming Raider and Tanner start.
That's who I would. Oh, sorry, I would project those two right now on paper, probably your starters. But I'm telling you, Falatau Satuala is a 4-star talent, and Raider was a 4-star talent in his own right.
Yeah,
those are two really highly thought of guys. Don't be surprised if they make a strong push, both of them, for starting reps in spring ball. Now, a guy like Tanner Walls over there, who similar to Crew, is a walk-on. That's the crazy thing about this. You have 4-star talent sitting behind walk-on safeties.
Yes.
But I can tell you, a guy like Tanner Wall's like, yeah, you guys may think you're taking my spot. Ain't no way you're taking it. That's the other thing about this is I appreciate the mentality a guy like Tanner Wall has taken here because he easily could have done the same thing that Crew did. Opted to go somewhere else, look for an opportunity to get extra playing time. And he said, I'm going to bet on myself. I'm going to double down here. And we'll see how it all plays out, but the nice part, there is the future for BYU in the secondary with Jay Hill coaching up the safeties, and particularly Gennaro Guilford with those cornerbacks, looks really, really bright.
Yeah, we're excited to see. All right, Jake Hatch, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Anytime you want me to come in, I'm happy to do it.
If you guys don't listen to Jake's podcast on a daily basis, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Jeez.
Just kidding.
Okay.
No, Jake's show's really great, and you're the only show that provides daily content, and it's good content. And so, if you're not already, please go over to the Locked On BYU Cougars podcast, give it a subscribe, give it a follow, and please reward Jake for joining us on our show.
Thank you.
Also, again, if you like what you hear on this show, please give us a review, subscribe to the podcast. Tell the algorithm that this podcast is worth listening to, and we'll get this up and running. That'll do it for us today. This is the Loyal Cougars podcast, broadcasting from the Aptive Podcast Studio. We'll see you next week.